Thank you very much. So we're going to run a panel now on Industry 4.0. So I invite the panelists to come up and join me here. We're very lucky. We have an immensely competent panel here. I feel very humbled to be facilitating the discussion we're going to have. We have, we're all here now. I'll introduce the panelists and then we'll launch into a discussion around about where industry, the whole of business is going in terms of big data, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and all this amazing exponential change that we heard about this morning. I should probably start by introducing myself. I lead the optimization research group here at Data 61, and I'm also a professor of artificial intelligence at the University of New South Wales. But there is much greater expertise, I suspect, on our panel. So starting at this end, we have John Grill, who is the chairman and non-executive director at Worley Parsons. We have Jeff Colbert, who's the president and chief executive of GE Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. And third along, we have Kathy Foley, who's one of the leaders of the CSIRO Manufacturing 4.0 project here, flagship at CSIRO. And finally, at the end, we have Angus Armour, who is a principal advisor to the Business Council of Australia. And I think we've got 3 microphones between 4. So I'll rely upon you to juggle the microphones. So just to begin, this panel is about, great, we have a fourth. Our pigeonhole problem's been solved. We now have 4 microphones. Our panel is entitled, Is Australia Missing Out on Industry 4.0? So I really want to start by asking the panelists in turn what for them they see as Industry 4.0 and what are the really important changes that they see coming along in the next decade or two. So, John.
Can you hear? Is it on?
Yeah, that's on.
I was thinking about
maybe a bit closer.
I was thinking about answering this question this morning and thinking about the various roles I have in life and how they interact with that. And one of them is as the chairman of Worley Parsons, and Worley Parsons is. Worley Parsons is working very hard in this space to convince its clients to use the electronic models of the facilities they've built in the ongoing maintenance of those facilities. And to date, that's been very rarely done. So that's one of the changes that's going on. I'm also the chair of the Growth Centre's Advisory Board, which Linwin was talking about cyber security before. We're in the process of finding a chair for the Cyber Security Growth Centre at the moment, so that's an activity of mine, and the other 4 growth centres are all working in existing industries of Australia that need some help in relation to innovation, competitiveness and cooperation. So, I mean, that's a start for my involvement in this area, the area of Industry 4.0.
Jeff, GE is a huge, great, broad business. So what does it mean to some company as broad as GE?
Yeah, so look, we're a big company. We've been around for 130 years. We started off making light bulbs, and over the last 130 years, we've evolved to be a manufacturer of things like aircraft engines and power plants and wind turbines and diagnostic healthcare equipment like CT scanners, MRIs. But we're going through the biggest change and evolution in our 130-year history right now as we transfer from being a company that just makes heavy metal to a company that also makes software. We're becoming a software company as rapidly as we are a hardware company. And it's all about taking those software applications, putting them onto your machines, and then using the data that comes off them to run your equipment more efficiently. So to give you an example, on a flight between, say, Sydney and LA, we can get a terabyte of data off our engines, off our aircraft engines, and we can use that data to help the airlines understand how they can run the engines more efficiently, how they can use less fuel, how they can reduce carbon emissions, how they can actually get more life out of the engines, and importantly, how they can predict when you're going to have a problem with an engine. So you reduce unplanned downtime, unplanned maintenance, and we're putting that technology all over our equipment. And this is going to be the big differentiator for us over the next decade. We don't worry about being disrupted by two guys in a garage building a new aircraft engine, because there's billions of dollars of R&D that goes into that. But we worry about two guys in a garage building software that makes our engines run more efficiently, and then we lose control of the hardware. So that's what we're focusing on at the moment.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that? How does GE get itself to keep light on its feet, like the little startups, the two guys writing the software? Because that's the big challenge for corporations, for large companies, to keep
Well,
themselves
it's driven
alive.
primarily out of fear and paranoia, right? So you're constantly worried about being disrupted. You're constantly worried about, are you going to be around for the next 130 years? So, we drive ourselves to constantly change and innovate, because we know that we have no choice. If we don't, we'll be disrupted. So, we spend a lot of time thinking about the culture of the organization. Are we fast? Are we agile? Are we nimble? Are we too slow? Are we being bureaucratic? Are our decision-making processes too burdensome? Are we risk-averse? And we've got a lot of cultural processes that we have to invest in to enable us to be able to compete with the startup community and the entrepreneurial community that are, in many respects, our natural enemy. So that's what we think a lot about. And we also collaborate a lot more than we ever used to. It used to be the case that when you were a big company like ours, you thought that the best ideas were always within the four corners of your organization. We no longer think that way. We now look to collaborate with big companies, with organizations such as CSIRO and Data61. We've got relationships with you guys. We look at partnering with the startup community, with universities, research centers, because we know that the best ideas don't just live within our company.
Great. Kathy, moving on to you, and perhaps probably a little more focused on manufacturing.
Yes, so at manufacturing in CSIRO, we're trying to either help big industries be more efficient and effective, but the other is for SMEs, particularly in Australia, which I think it's 97% of companies in Australia as SMEs, and we want to make them globally competitive. And one of the things that you say as industrial manufacturing 4.0, if you go through looking at 1 was the Industrial Revolution, 2 was just-in-time manufacturing, 3 was going through and creating robotics and sort of replacing people, I guess, in the factory. But 4 is all about actually bringing together not just the robotics, the sensing and the information, but it's also creating more levers that industry or industry owners can pull in order to make their companies efficient, effective and globally competitive. So how you can do that so it's cheap for that person who's a small startup person in a garage, and also getting them to realise they don't have to do it all themselves. And because Australia is a company where we are very proud and independent, we actually have to get people to start talking to each other and realising that keeping it to yourself is the pathway to failure, and opening up and sharing and collaborating is actually the pathway to success.
And Angus, I mean, in your relationship with CBA and people, you speak to a very wide spectrum of businesses. What do you see the changes there, not just thinking about manufacturing, but the broader business?
Well, coming back to your question about Industry 4.0 and how we see that influencing business community here, if I could personalize it, when I was 10 years old, I think my parents' expectations would be that as a young adult, I would be dealing with government and business in a way that had not profoundly changed from their experience. I know now that a 10-year-old in our society in 15 years will be dealing with business and government in profoundly different ways. And that's the first lesson. The second lesson being their expectation as well at the age of 25. I won something, that's fantastic. Their expectations at the age of 25 are also going to be significantly greater than I might have had.
So thinking about the title of this panel, which is Australia may be missing out this change. Are we ready? And what should a business be doing today, like Wolseley Parsons, be doing today to prepare for all this change that we are no doubt expecting? John.
Well, I guess it is one of my other roles in life. I'm on the boards of two startup companies in the technology area. One of them is called Pooled Energy and is automating and remotely controlling the water quality of swimming pools. And it's also an energy provider for those, and it's a very disruptive technology in relation to the existing swimming pool industry in Australia. So, I mean, that's a change. The other one I'm involved with is a maintenance management system, a computerized one of those called Locate, which is, again, I'm helping them take both ideas outside of Australia. And to me, the essence of all businesses starting up in Australia at the moment is to have an international view of the world, to be thinking that you're setting up a business for the world, not just setting up a business for your local area.
So Jeff, I'm not going to put you on the spot on GE, but the businesses that GE has to interact, do you think they're ready for change? And what should they be doing today to make themselves ready for this very disruptive period we're going to go through?
Well, I mean, I think you first got to, it's never too late, right? I think that the notion that it's too late is inaccurate. You know, I think in terms of what we're seeing with the fourth industrial revolution and the use of big data and analytics, we're on the first page of what could be, you know, a 20-chapter, 30-chapter book. So it's never too late. I think it's great that the culture within Australia is starting to think about this, and I think the National Innovation and Science Agenda is a step in the right direction. It's now part of our dialogue, but we have to turn it from being just a conversation into reality, and that requires investment. So from our perspective, from a company perspective, you know, we put between 5 and 10% of our revenues every year into research and development. We have invested over $2 billion into software development capability over the last 5 years, because we know that we have to be able to make that investment if we're going to be able to do something meaningful in this area. So it's going to require significant investment. And the thing that I would say is that I think from the Australian perspective, we've got to be careful that we focus on the right areas where we have comparative advantage. I agree with the comment that we can't be thinking of markets of 24 million. We have to be thinking of markets of 7 billion if we're going to be relevant. We also have to be thinking about areas and industries where we can actually have a global impact. I mean, I think it's fun to be thinking about the consumer application market, but putting a watermelon on the head of a cat or doing an app like that isn't going to generate real wealth for the Australian economy, right? We've got to be thinking about the industries where we have real comparative advantage: oil and gas, mining, agribusiness, fintech, healthcare. If we can direct investment into those areas, if we can come up with technological breakthroughs that we can then scale and send out and export to the rest of the world, we'll create real wealth and growth and create jobs for the Australian market. So from my perspective as the leader of GE in Australia, I focus on those industries where we have comparative advantage, and I try to put Australia as a pilot market where we can actually develop applications connected to our technology that we can export to the rest of the world.
Kathy, you talk to a lot of different businesses as well.
Yeah, so I think we were on a pathway, a bad pathway to missing out on manufacturing 4.0 or industry 4.0, because we had a system where you had the university sector, the government lab sector and the industry sector, and nobody talked to each other. There was almost no mobility between those sectors. And in a short space of time, we're beginning to see joint appointments. We're seeing people going out and working in industry. We're seeing researchers realising that just publishing a paper isn't what their job is. Their job is actually to take things further down the line. But we have had an education system that has raised our particularly technology-based and STEM-based career career enthusiasts to actually think my job is to be a university professor, and if they don't do that, they've failed. And so since only about 0.3% of people become university professors, we've got 99 point something percent of our STEM graduates who think they're failures. And opening up a Pandora's box of opportunity is something that's happening. So that's a huge change, and I think that's something that's really only started to kick off in the last 2 years, 18 months, and I think we're seeing an extraordinary acceleration in that, which is personally unbelievably exciting. The second thing is something which is...
I'll take that criticism as a university professor on the head. I actually have a second job, panel host, right?
So you're a good example of actually crossing that boundary, and it's really structural issues like different superannuation schemes, which mean that people don't, want to move around. So detail we don't need to go into here. But the other thing which I think is really, really exciting and is the game changer in Australia is the recent government policies, both in the innovation statement in December, which is saying that the government realises, as the biggest procurer in Australia, that they're going to be saying we want to make sure we look to take more risk and invest and procure locally where we can, and be willing to maybe take something or buy something that fails. And anyone who lives in Sydney remembers that a government did that when they were trying to get pay pass on trains, and they used a startup company in Australia. Failed miserably and had to go somewhere else, and that was seen as bad. We've got to have more of those mistakes that governments support. The second one is the Defence White Paper is so exciting because it's actually got in there the willingness to see Australian SMEs as part of the supply chain. And that change in government policy is going to have an extraordinary ricochet effect or domino effect across the country, because SMEs will suddenly have local customers, which then they can springboard to have global customers.
So Angus, to pick up that theme there, of what should government be doing? You talk to BCA, who are in some sense one of the interfaces between business and government. Are they doing enough? Are you as positive as Kathy is about the innovation economy that they're trying to create?
I think we're equally positive about the innovation statement, the innovation and science statement. That was a very significant first step forward, and we were supportive of every element. I think government will still face a significant challenge because our economy is not as competitive as it needs to be to attract the investment that we require to compete in this area. We're certainly not anywhere close to the ranking we'd like to achieve on innovation, for example. And we need a more flexible economy. And those are themes that as the Business Council you would expect us to say, but I think if you look at international rankings, it's a fair call. However, I tend to agree with Jeff. I don't think we've missed the boat at all on this. If you look at McKinsey research at the beginning of the year of even the economies that feel most on the ball, let's say Germany and the United States, a very significant majority are aware of Industry 4.0, but in fact don't have their own plans in place yet. They're thinking about it, but they haven't actually moved forward. So I think we are culpable in the sense that we need greater awareness. It was interesting to me that when I walked around out here, I actually asked a couple of people, well, they said, what are you doing? I said, I'm talking about Industry 4.0. They said, what's that? Interesting. So I think a general level of awareness is quite important. But come back to your question of what government should do. Government will have to make choices. And that's going to be difficult. I think we still have a lot of work to do in the tertiary education system, and that's not a shot at universities at all. It's an entire system, and it's how we interact with that system. I think we will need to make choices about how we help industries that are exiting. I think the experience of the automotive sector was salutary. I don't think we want to repeat that again in terms of putting money into an industry that we know is in decline. We need to help people move to their next profession as quickly as we can. But with Kathy, we're confident that the government is quite aware of these challenges.
Jeff, are you happy with what government is doing in terms of encouraging innovation and the change that's going?
So I spent 7 years outside of Australia. I was up in Asia and in a global role, and I came back to Australia 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And at that time, I was worried by what I saw. I felt like we were lacking ambition as a country, and I also felt that the world was becoming a lot more competitive, and there were a lot of countries out there that were a lot more ambitious than us. But they didn't have the same level of ability, but they were very, very ambitious. And I came back to Australia and I thought, gee, we're just not, we're not getting it. We're not aware of what's happening out there. And we don't truly appreciate the fact that we operate in a global market. And technology collapses distance, right? Technology dissolves borders. So globalization is real, it's here, it's now, and technology is accelerating it. I've seen that change, though, over the last 18 months. And I think that the government's National Innovation and Science agenda at the back end of last year was a real step in the right direction. I think the dialogue is now on the agenda. We're talking about it. The challenge is now to go from the theory to the reality, as I said before, because innovation is very easy to say, but it's a lot harder to do. And the challenge is not just for the government, but it's for all of us, and I agree, it's for universities, it's for the private sector, it's for the government, all to collaborate together to come up with the right policy, regulatory, investment environment that really promotes investment into innovation and technology, and to focus on the areas where we have real comparative advantage and global advantage, where we can actually have a real impact on a global scale. I don't think we're there yet, but the conversation has certainly started, and we all have to be in it together, because we are all in it together. Because we're talking about the future prosperity of Australia as a nation. We're talking about the country that our children are going to grow up in and want to work in. And so it's really our responsibility now as the leaders in this current environment to get this right. And the conversation started. We now have to really accelerate the effort.
So to go to that question of our children and our future, it's a topic that's come up, I think, almost in every one of these talks or panels so far today, which is education. What is the role that education needs to play? How do we have to change education? So who wants to pick that up?
I think that's a really tricky one. I was actually, in this environment, I'm not sure whether I should admit this, but I was on the committee that helped assess the physics national curriculum. And just the fact that we could get a national curriculum in the first place was a major achievement. And I think that's something which, for a big country like Australia, even though we've got we're big in size with our state system, and actually that state system, I think, can at times hold us back because it slows things down to get agreement. So that slowness of changing a curriculum is something that's really, I think, a big issue for Australia. And the need to be agile in the way we do business also needs to be agile in the way we educate our young people is really critical. And how we actually do that both in educating our teachers so that they're able to be aware of what's in the offing. We've got a situation at the moment where I think something like 70% of teachers are in my age group and are going to be retiring soon. And we have a follow-up behind, but those people who have been training as teachers have actually been either moving out of the teaching workforce or actually working casually and not necessarily building their skill set. And so I think the plan for teacher education, how we're going to actually staff our schools, how we're going to make sure that it's not just the well-to-do schools in good socioeconomic areas. They're the areas we need to worry about. They're going fine. They have these extracurricular things that can add in the extra around the curriculum that's there. So we heard earlier today about the clubs and things like that, which are so exciting and great. But if you start going to low socioeconomic areas, they're still struggling with really basic skills and not realising that unless you've got a level of literacy, both numerically and also just reading, we're going to have a society that's either those who know and have access to technology and understand it and can do it, and those who are really going to become the illiterate of the future because they don't have access to technology, they don't know how it works, and are just excluded from it. And that differential between society is a huge risk for Australia, because you just have to look at all the data around the world that says as soon as you have huge variations in those who have and those who haven't, that's when you get problems in your economy and every other social aspect.
So we're going to open it up to questions from the floor very shortly. To start planning your questions, we'll have a roving microphone. But just to go to that point there, which is the threat of rising inequality and another threat, the threat of actual unemployment. There's a lot of fear that we see in the press and elsewhere that 45% of all jobs in Australia are under threat of automation. Should we be fearful? Or should we be optimistic that this is going to buy prosperity for our children and allow us to retire in comfort? Jeff?
Look, I'm a big believer in the ability of the human race to work it out. And if we weren't prepared to take risks on the job market changing, then I'd ride a horse to work and you'd all be blacksmiths, right? That would be the reality of the world. But every generation works it out. And I think we're going to see a change in the nature of jobs. We're going to see different skills required. We're going to see people moving from industries to different industries. But the human race has an ability to work things out, and we can't let the fear of change get in the way of progress, because the productivity benefits and the opportunities that will flow from this fourth industrial revolution will far outweigh the risks associated with the transfer of jobs. And I think we'll just work it out.
Angus?
Well, I'm with Jeff in the sense of being optimistic. I do believe there's no question that, we've shown that we can adopt to new technologies and a new global economy. The issue for me will be the pace at which we change and what that means for the people who might be left behind. That's what I worry about. So we could get there eventually, or we can get there faster if we put the systems in place to make sure that our education system is delivering the basic requirements and helping people prepare for the future.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions from the floor. We have a microphone. Please identify yourself before you, and wait for the microphone to go. So the gentleman there in the middle, wait for the microphone to come so that everyone can hear you in this big hall, please.
Hi, Elliot Duff from Data61. The question about how should we help the SMEs engage in Industry 4.0? What should we put in place to help them out?
So, can you try it again with the microphone closer to your mouth?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. How should we assist SMEs with getting up to speed on Industry 4.0? What should we put in place?
How should we help SMEs get into 4.0? John?
I mean, one of the main ideas of the growth centres is to help SMEs and to work with SMEs and large business collaboratively and to connect them up with the research institutions, with CSIRO and with the universities, and to essentially provide a path for the SMEs to grow their businesses both within Australia and outside Australia. And I think, the growth centres, the Food and Ag Science Growth Centre has been going for a couple of years, and it is engaged maybe 100 SMEs in the food area and helped a number of those to grow into overseas markets. And I think the other 5, as they develop, will have the same effect in the other 5 industry streams that they're in. So certainly one of the key aspects of growth centres is to help SMEs to grow their business outside Australia and to collaborate with large business and research organisations.
Jeffrey, Kathy?
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting is that particularly startup companies never have any money. And we always, and also they're sort of usually got their own personal banking situation mixed in with their business because they're living on hand to mouth. And yet government grants are often requiring them to open their books to be able to apply for even the startup grants. So being able to have a level of risk that allows slightly dodgy setups, which often startups are, able to access those micro grants at the beginning to have their entree into collaborating with a university or a government lab like CSIRO is really essential. But the other is actually knowing where's the front door. So, if you're an SME, you've got a problem, you're willing to take that risk and say, I'll lean into the discomfort of talking to some tech head who I know I need the solution, but I'm not really sure, how to engage with them. they've got PhDs or something at from Harvard or something like that, and I'm just got a year 10 certificate or something, but I'm very entrepreneurial. It's sort of that, breaking down those barriers is really critical, and one of the things we've found is opening our doors and making the invisible visible by having SMEs know how to make contact with people, because our websites aren't the way to do it. It's actually events like this, or actually having breakfasts, or inviting local SMEs to come in, or having something which shows this is the front door, this is how you connect. I think the growth centres will be very important in that as well, is critical. And that, I think those two things are the starting to create the first connection, and then build on that. The ability to share risk and understanding what SMEs need, and for researchers to actually realise that it's not just about them and what their favourite research topic is to work on, and this is a way of maybe funding it. It's actually changing your mindset as a researcher to say, how can my capability, not necessarily my project, but my capability assist an SME so that they can be successful? It's a bit of a change.
Jeff, you look like you were. Jeff.
Oh no, I agree with what's been said. I just think the nature of business is changing, and the openness and the collaboration which is evolving represents a huge opportunity for everyone. I think big companies like ours can learn from startups and SMEs, and we can bring those ideas into our organisation, and we do. We've got incubator programs, and we've got venture funding that we do internally when we see a great idea that's aligned to our business. But at the same time, we're happy also to reach down and support the SME and startup community by bringing some of our own capability to bear as well. And then you look at the horizontal connections between government and universities and corporates and organisations like CSIRO and Data 61. I see collaboration at a level that never happened before, and that represents opportunity for everyone. I would just say stick your hand up and ask as well. I think we're in an environment, we're in a time in our evolution where you can just, if you've got a great idea and you want to pitch it to someone, then people are more receptive than ever. So just have the courage to back yourself in, and there are so many different ways you can do that now that didn't exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Okay, who wants to stick their hand up and ask the next question?
Well, I've got one over here.
No, one up at the front there. Lady at the front.
Hi, I'm Jenny Conley from the Australian Advanced Manufacturing Council. And Jeff, you mentioned a couple of times our comparative advantage globally. Australia should focus on our comparative advantages, which I agree with. Can you elaborate? You mentioned obviously watermelon on the head of cat apps aren't your sort of idea of possibly the thing to do, but what would you say Australia's advantages are?
Well, I look at industries like mining, oil and gas, agribusiness, fintech, healthcare. These are industries where we have global expertise and a leading position. We have many global companies that are actually based and headquartered in Australia, and we have deep domain capability. And these are global industries. And if you think about the contribution that they make to Australia's GDP, to the jobs that are created in Australia, and to the wealth that's created in Australia, a 1% increase in productivity in those industries can have a significant flow-on effect to the wealth of the nation and the creation of jobs. So I think it's important that we really focus on those areas, and they're part of the government's growth agenda, and so it's something that has already been identified. And so I think that's an area that really needs to be focused on. You've got to be careful that in the conversation around innovation, we all like being photographed with a guy wearing a T-shirt hanging out in Redfern, right? Because that makes you look cool. But the fact is that the real value drivers for the Australian economy are in those really big traditional industries where we have global scale, global penetration, and they generate significant wealth to the Australian economy. And by the way, those industries are ripe for technology. Absolutely ripe for technology. The mining industry has been a very manual industry historically. The trucks that move the coal out of the open cut coal mines, they have a sticker in the top right-hand side which says service at 6,000 kilometres. If that truck breaks down at 5,995 kilometres, that's an unplanned outage. But you can put sensors all over those trucks, and you can start to be predictive about when that truck needs maintenance, and then you can start to build that into their maintenance cycles and make the companies much more productive and efficient. So that's just a very simple example, but it's an industry. Those are industries that are ripe for technology, that need the investment and can use the data and analytics to drive productivity, which flows straight through to the bottom line of the wealth of the Australian economy.
Does anyone else on the panel want to throw in their favourite area that's ripe for growth?
Yeah, I think I'll just reinforce that by also saying there are growth centres in all of the areas that were mentioned, with the exception of financial services, and there's also a growth centre in advanced manufacturing and one coming in cybersecurity. So I think they're all areas that Australia can really grow in, that we've, if anything, fallen back in recent times. If I use my technology example, as I was talking to a fellow the other day, as doing a startup in the mining area, in using a camera and sensors to evaluate the minerals in front of the camera, instead of using sort of as a virtual geologist or geophysicist. And they're using exactly the same technology, and in fact fighting for the same resources as autonomous vehicles. So, and that's certainly being developed through an Australian company.
Great. One more question. There's a question at the back there, halfway. Oh. Where's the microphone?
Hello, this is Hamish Lee from the New South Wales Business Chamber. Thank you for your comments on how to provide SMEs with these opportunities. One of the issues that we've found recently is that, and there's been some research out of WSU on the topic, but that it's still a minority of SMEs are actually interested in growth and innovation. So whether that's they don't understand what it involves, or they have some other conception of what innovation is. Does the panel have any ideas on keys to unlocking the desire to innovate in industry?
So the question is, what are the keys to unlock the desire to innovate? Because not all SMEs are actually necessarily wanting to do this. Kathy.
That's a really good question, because I think we've actually, as a society in Australia, become a little bit lazy. We've got a great banking industry. In Sydney, you just have to buy a property and sit on it and you get wealthy. And you know, if you buy shares in BHP, you can sit, or Rio Tinto, hopefully they'll send you a nice dividend check. So to some extent, we've got a whole generation where we haven't had to think real hard, because in fact, it's really interesting. If you look at some studies that have been done of kids at school and seeing whether or not they like science or not, it's actually directly related. Their interest in science and technology is directly related to their GDP inversely. So that the more rich the country, the less interested they are about innovation or technology, because they can buy it. You just go to the Apple store and buy your latest gizmo. And so how do we actually get our community, who actually, if you look in Australia, we've got an extraordinary track record of homegrown inventions, to actually reignite the idea of building stuff in the shed and getting people to realise they can tinker and make things and be creative. And at the moment we have, and you just have to look at where kids are choosing to do their subjects at school, they are thinking it very much in terms of creativity is in arts, in drama, in creative traditional sorts of things, in the way we call creativity. If you said you can be creative as a scientist or a mathematician, they'll laugh at you. So how do we actually change that is getting the realisation that creativity and opportunity and thinking that will lead to potential and entrepreneurial ideas that can lead to a new way of creating a living for yourself, so that we get our kids at school to start realising, I'm not going to leave school to get a job, I'm going to leave school to create my own job. And that's something which some schools are doing, and if we can get that garnered across the whole education system, we will have a very different culture. And I think that's where we have to start, is actually realising that creativity is about entrepreneurialism, thinking about creating your future so we're not running out of jobs, we're actually creating our jobs, and that we're actually letting our young people realise that the future is for them to embrace and run with.
Well, I think that's a fantastic thought to end on, that as so many conversations we've had today, a lot comes back to education and to our future and our children. So I want you to join with me in thanking our panel for giving us their thoughts. Thank you very much.